Oak Ridge, California. May 11, 2021. A town of neat suburban homes and freshly blooming flowers, a place that should have felt peaceful, yet a sense of underlying tension simmered beneath its quiet facade. The early spring air carried a whisper of change, but for Layla, it was a quiet agony that filled her lungs instead of peace. She stood by the window, looking out at the neat rows of houses across the street. The trees were just beginning to blossom, their pink flowers catching the sun's golden rays, but all she could see was emptiness. The world outside was full of life, but inside her home, the silence was deafening. The clink of dishes in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic ticking of the clock, it all felt so distant. She was trapped in a space that was supposed to feel like home, but felt instead like a prison. She could feel her heart, heavy with unspoken words, slowly crumbling under the weight of isolation. Layla, at 28, had always prided herself on being a dutiful wife. Raised in a conservative Muslim family, she had always known her role. Love, honor, respect, those were the values she held dear. She married Rashid 3 years ago, a man with a steady job at a prominent tech company in Silicon Valley, a man who was kind, dependable, and loving. Yet, despite all that, she was still alone. Rashid had always been a good husband. He worked long hours at his job, putting in late nights, taking on extra shifts to provide for their home. He loved her, of that she was sure. He smiled warmly when he came home, always eager to hear about her day. He encouraged her to try new recipes, to bring a sense of joy back into their kitchen. He tried to make her feel loved in the small moments, the ones that many would overlook. But small moments weren't enough. They never were. Layla longed for more. She longed for late-night conversations about their dreams, for spontaneous laughter, for shared intimacy. But Rashid had become a ghost in their home, more focused on his career than on her. She had told herself it was just a phase, a consequence of his success. But as the months wore on, it became painfully clear, the emotional distance between them was growing. They spoke in polite, rehearsed exchanges about chores, bills, and responsibilities, no room for warmth, no room for connection. She had always thought that marriage would be different. She had imagined it full of joy, companionship, a deep emotional bond. But reality had been far from what she expected. She felt the creeping emptiness each day when Rashid left for work before dawn and returned long after the sun had set. She felt like an outsider in her own marriage, and worse, she was starting to feel like a stranger to herself. She wanted to scream, to cry, to let it all out, but she couldn't. She had been taught to be strong, to be silent, to endure. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Rashid had returned from another long day at work. His tired smile didn't reach his eyes. He kissed her cheek, dropped his briefcase by the door, and immediately began to unload his day. She nodded along, murmuring the occasional response, but her mind was elsewhere. It was always the same. Same routine, same routine. She could feel herself slipping away into the monotony of it all. It was in the midst of this isolation that Omar, Rashid's older brother, reappeared in their lives. He had recently gone through a tough breakup, and, after weeks of staying with friends, he had nowhere else to turn. He moved back in with them, and his presence, so full of energy and life, was the change that Layla hadn't realized she was desperately craving. Omar was nothing like Rashid. He had a carefree charm that seemed to fill the room. Where Rashid's quiet focus on work left Layla yearning, Omar's laughter brought a sense of joy that she hadn't felt in years. He had a gift for making people feel at ease. Layla found herself drawn to his magnetic personality, to the way he made her feel like she wasn't invisible. He didn't need to try, his humor, his spontaneity, his warmth all seemed to flow naturally. In the beginning, things were simple. They shared meals together, reminisced about childhood memories, and spent evenings watching movies. It was innocent. But something had shifted in Layla. Omar had become her escape. When Rashid was gone, she found herself seeking Omar's company more and more. He was a breath of fresh air in a home that had felt suffocating. Layla had always been taught that emotional connections outside of marriage were dangerous, that loyalty was sacred. Yet, with Omar, it was different. She wasn't betraying anyone. She wasn't seeking an affair, but she couldn't ignore the fact that he made her feel alive in a way Rashid hadn't in a long time. It wasn't love, not yet, but something deeper, something that felt impossible to define. And that terrified her. As the days passed, Layla's isolation only deepened. The contrast between her quiet existence with Rashid and the vibrant connection she felt with Omar was impossible to ignore. But guilt weighed on her. She loved Rashid, but she was beginning to feel something for Omar that she had never imagined she would. She was stepping into dangerous territory. And yet, in those stolen moments, when Omar laughed, when he listened to her, when he simply cared, Layla couldn't help but feel alive again. But how long could she live in this world of shadows? How long could she balance these two realities, before one of them came crashing down? The days began to blur together for Layla. Every morning, she woke to the sound of Rashid's quiet movements, his departure before the sun rose. Every evening, she waited, her gaze fixated on the front door, longing for the moment when he would return, hoping that something, anything, would change. But it never did. The long hours stretched on, each one carrying her further into a sense of isolation that had become all-consuming. Her once bright eyes, full of life and ambition, now seemed dulled, as though the spark of who she was had been slowly extinguished. It was around this time that Omar, Rashid's older brother, appeared unexpectedly at their doorstep. Layla had known of Omar, of course. He had been a part of Rashid's life long before she'd come into the picture, but their interactions had been few. He was always the distant figure, someone who floated in and out of their lives without ever truly settling down. But now, Omar was in need. He had recently gone through a painful breakup, and after months of instability, he had nowhere else to turn. Rashid, ever the dutiful brother, had insisted he come stay with them. At first, it was awkward. Layla wasn't sure how to react to the sudden shift in their household dynamics. She and Rashid had grown accustomed to their quiet routine, and now, the energy in their home had shifted dramatically. Omar was loud, spontaneous, and, despite his recent heartbreak, undeniably charismatic. His presence filled the empty spaces in their house, and for the first time in a long while, Layla felt like she was no longer alone. Omar's arrival brought with it an energy Layla had not realized she had been missing. He didn't make small talk like Rashid did, he engaged with her, asked questions, shared stories, and, most of all, listened. In the evenings when Rashid was still at work, Omar would sit with Layla in the living room, talking about anything and everything. They laughed together over old memories, and Layla found herself drawn to his warmth in a way that she hadn't anticipated. It was effortless, the connection between them, like a fire that ignited as soon as they shared their first conversation. At first, it was innocent. They were family, after all. They were just spending time together. But something started to shift. The laughter that had once been light-hearted began to carry an edge to it, a shared vulnerability that Layla had not expected. She began to realize that when she was with Omar, she felt something stir within her, something that had been dormant for far too long. There was an ease in his presence, a comfort that she had missed. His eyes held a quiet understanding, and his words, though few, always seemed to offer the exact reassurance she needed. She had never experienced anything like this with Rashid. Her relationship with Rashid, though solid and based on mutual respect, had grown routine, devoid of the emotional depth Layla now found herself craving. Rashid was kind, but he wasn't perceptive, not in the way Omar was. Layla had tried to explain her feelings to Rashid before, but he was always preoccupied with work or distracted by the pressures of his job. His love, though genuine, felt distant. In contrast, Omar's presence was electrifying. He made Layla feel seen, heard, and, for the first time in a long while, appreciated. The guilt came quickly after that. She tried to push it down, to bury it beneath the surface, but it festered, gnawing at her with every shared moment she spent with Omar. She loved Rashid, of that she was certain. He was the man she had married, the man she had promised to be faithful to. And yet, she couldn't deny the magnetic pull she felt towards his brother. It wasn't that she didn't care for Rashid anymore, it was that Omar had awakened something in her, something she hadn't even known she was missing. It started with the small, fleeting moments, shared glances that lingered a bit too long, a brush of hands as they passed each other in the kitchen, the way their conversations flowed so easily that Layla forgot where the time went. Each touch, each smile, felt like a secret. The thrill of it was undeniable, but so was the weight of the guilt that followed. She had never imagined herself in this situation. She never thought she could betray Rashid in such a profound way, and yet here she was, caught in a web of emotions she had no idea how to navigate. And then, the inevitable happened. The line between friendship and something deeper began to blur. They spent more and more time together, Omar coming to her with tales of his childhood, Layla laughing at his jokes, feeling something stir inside her she had long buried. There were moments when she caught herself staring at him, feeling her heart race as their eyes met. It wasn't just friendship anymore. There was something else, something unspoken, hanging between them like a secret neither of them dared acknowledge. One evening, while Rashid worked late into the night, Layla and Omar found themselves alone in the house. The conversation began as usual, light and easy, but it quickly shifted. They were talking about the struggles of adjusting to the American way of life, how difficult it was to maintain their cultural values while navigating the expectations of their new world. Layla found herself confiding in Omar, her thoughts flowing freely as he listened intently. She spoke about the loneliness she felt in her marriage, the distance that had grown between her and Rashid. "I just want to feel alive again," Layla admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Omar didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, looking at her, his gaze softening. Then, slowly, he reached out, brushing a stray hair from her face. His touch was gentle, but it sent a wave of electricity through her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, everything else in the world disappeared, and it was just the two of them. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a tension neither of them could ignore anymore. It was then that Layla realized, she was falling for him. And the more she tried to deny it, the stronger her feelings became. Omar wasn't just a distraction anymore, he had become the person who made her feel seen, understood, and cherished in ways Rashid had failed to for so long. She didn't know where this was heading. She didn't know how to navigate this complex web of emotions she had become entangled in. But one thing was clear, her life had just become infinitely more complicated. What started as innocent companionship was now something far more dangerous. And Layla was terrified of what it would cost her. The warmth of summer settled over Oak Ridge, California, the long evenings stretching lazily into night. The world outside was alive with the hum of crickets and the glow of streetlights, but within the walls of Layla's home, an unsettling tension hung in the air. Rashid's long hours at work had become a familiar rhythm, so predictable, so steady, that it felt as though his absence was part of the natural order. Yet for Layla, his absence was no longer a simple matter of routine, it had become the space in which her secret began to grow. She had never imagined she would find herself in this situation. She had never envisioned herself in a tangled web of lies, torn between two men, the one she had promised her life to, and the other who had ignited something in her that she had long thought extinguished. Her marriage to Rashid had always been about respect, about devotion, but with Omar, Layla felt seen in ways she hadn't known she needed. It started so innocently, shared meals, light-hearted jokes, and deep conversations about their lives. But as the weeks passed, their connection began to shift into something more intimate, something far more dangerous. Every evening, when Rashid's car pulled out of the driveway, the house seemed to hold its breath. Omar would come over, often with a bottle of wine or a takeaway dinner. They would eat together, sometimes watch a movie, or simply sit on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. And in those moments, Layla felt a connection so powerful it was almost unbearable. Omar wasn't just her brother-in-law anymore, he had become her confidant, her companion, the one who understood the depths of her loneliness. He listened to her in a way Rashid never had, without judgment or distraction. He saw her, really saw her, and that made all the difference. But the more time they spent together, the more she could feel the shift in their dynamic. Layla would catch herself stealing glances at Omar when he wasn't looking. Her heart would race when their hands brushed, her breath catching in her throat whenever he smiled at her with that quiet, knowing look. She tried to tell herself that it was nothing, just a fleeting moment, just a temporary lapse. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The lines between friendship and something more were beginning to blur. What had once been casual flirtation had become something heavier, more intimate. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, the unspoken words, everything between them had begun to carry a weight that neither of them was willing to confront. And yet, neither of them was willing to pull away either. One evening, when Rashid had stayed late for yet another work project, Layla and Omar found themselves alone once again, this time sitting close together on the couch. The tension between them was palpable. They had spent hours talking about their shared experiences, the cultural divides they both struggled to navigate, and the unspoken pressures they both faced in their personal lives. Layla found herself opening up more than she had ever done before, her voice trembling as she confessed how suffocating her life had become. "I never imagined it would be like this," she admitted, her gaze not meeting his. "I thought I would be happy, fulfilled, you know. But it feels like I'm just here. Existing. Waiting." Omar, who had been listening intently, reached out and gently placed a hand on her arm. His touch sent a shockwave through her, a rush of warmth spreading from where his fingers brushed her skin. "You're not just existing, Layla," he said softly. "You deserve to feel alive. You deserve more than just this." His words hung in the air, charged with meaning. For a moment, Layla allowed herself to believe them. She had been waiting for this, for someone to see her, to acknowledge the weight she carried. She wanted to reach out, to close the gap between them, but the fear of what that might mean held her back. The fear of Rashid. The fear of losing everything. But Omar wasn't looking at her with pity or sympathy, he was looking at her with something deeper, something that spoke of desire and longing. She could see it in his eyes, and she knew that he saw her in the same way she had begun to see him. As more than just family. More than just a temporary distraction. The next few moments were a blur. Before she could stop herself, Layla found her lips brushing against Omar's in a hesitant kiss, a tentative exploration of feelings they had both buried. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears as she felt the world around them fade away. There was only Omar, his warmth, his touch, his presence filling the space between them. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an admission, a confession, a surrender. When they finally pulled away, neither of them spoke for a long time. Layla felt a rush of shame wash over her, but it was tempered by something else, something dangerous, a sense of exhilaration, a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. She had stepped across a line, and she wasn't sure she could go back. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. Omar was silent for a long time before he spoke. "Neither should I," he said quietly, his hand still resting gently on her arm. "But I can't pretend I don't feel it too." The words hung between them like a confession. A dangerous, secret confession that neither of them knew how to untangle. And yet, neither of them was willing to take it back. The thrill of the moment, the rush of emotions, was too powerful to ignore. That night, after Omar left, Layla sat alone in the darkness, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. She had opened a door she wasn't sure how to close. And in the silence of her home, as the hours dragged on, she realized that the life she had once known was slipping further and further away. Every moment with Omar felt like a forbidden escape, a brief glimpse of a life that could have been. And every moment she spent with Rashid, though full of love, though full of duty, felt like a shadow of what she truly craved. The weight of her choice hung heavy on her, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. The secret was no longer just a secret. It was a growing storm, one that threatened to consume them both. The weeks after that night were a blur for Layla. Each day seemed to blur into the next, filled with the same repetitive motions, but underneath, a storm was brewing. Her heart raced with every stolen glance, every lingering touch. The guilt clawed at her, relentless, suffocating, yet she couldn't seem to stop herself. She had crossed a line she couldn't undo, and now the weight of her secret pressed down on her, heavy and undeniable. What began as a moment of emotional escape, a fleeting connection with Omar, had evolved into something far more complicated. It was no longer just about her feelings for him, nor just the strain in her marriage. It was about a new, undeniable reality that she could not ignore. And that reality arrived in the form of a pregnancy test. Layla had been feeling nauseous for weeks, a discomfort she couldn't shake, but she brushed it off as the stress from her emotional turmoil. She had always been careful, always took precautions, and the thought that she could be pregnant seemed impossible, almost laughable. But when the test came back positive, everything changed. The small plastic stick sat in front of her on the bathroom counter, the two lines glaring up at her in cold confirmation. The world seemed to spin around her, and she felt as though the ground had been ripped from under her feet. She couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled as she held the test, her mind racing with the implications of what this meant. A child. She was carrying a child. A child that could never belong to Rashid, the man she had promised her life to. A child that belonged to the brother-in-law who had become something more. The weight of it hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over her with an intensity she had never known. She sat down on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, her back against the wall, and tried to steady her breath. What had she done? How could she have let this happen? Her mind flashed to Rashid. His warm smile. His gentle nature. His love. The man who had worked tirelessly to provide for them, who had been there for her through thick and thin. How could she betray him like this? How could she live with the fact that she was carrying a child that was not his? The thought of telling Rashid seemed impossible. She couldn't imagine the hurt in his eyes when he found out the truth. The shame, the guilt, the devastation. What would he say? How could she face him after everything? How could she break the heart of the one person who had trusted her completely? Layla's thoughts spiraled as the reality of her situation began to settle in. She knew she couldn't keep the secret forever. The truth would eventually come out, and when it did, the consequences would be catastrophic. She couldn't hide the pregnancy forever. The baby would eventually grow, and when it did, there would be no more hiding. There would be no more pretending that everything was okay. But the alternative, telling Rashid the truth, seemed just as unbearable. She couldn't bring herself to imagine the pain it would cause him, the anger and betrayal he would feel. She had already betrayed him once, and now, there was no way to undo the damage. She had ruined everything. Layla sat there, her head in her hands, lost in the overwhelming swirl of emotions that threatened to drown her. She had always prided herself on being strong, on doing what was right. But now, she couldn't even make the simplest decision. What was right? What could she possibly do now? Her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from Omar, and Layla's heart skipped a beat as she saw his name. The guilt hit her anew, sharper than before. She had never wanted to hurt Rashid, but here she was, tangled in a web of her own making. Omar had become more than just a brother-in-law, more than just a fleeting distraction. He had become the reason her life was spiraling out of control. The message from Omar was simple: we need to talk. Layla's stomach turned. They had talked so many times before, shared so much, her hopes, her fears, her frustrations, but this message felt different. There was something final about it. Her mind raced as she thought about what Omar could possibly want to discuss. Did he know? Did he suspect? Her hands shook as she typed out a response. What is it? The reply came quickly. I know it's complicated, but we can't keep pretending. We need to figure this out. What are we going to do? The weight of those words crushed Layla. She knew what Omar was asking. He was asking her to make a choice. To decide whether to keep this secret or to face it, to decide what their future would look like. But Layla wasn't sure if she could make that choice. She wasn't sure if she could live with the consequences of any of her decisions. Omar had become more than just a friend. He had become her confidant, the person she turned to when everything else felt like it was slipping through her fingers. But he was also the reason she was in this mess. He had been the catalyst, the person who had filled the void that Rashid had unknowingly left behind. And now, they were both caught in a situation that had no easy solution. Layla stood up, pacing the bathroom, her mind a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and confusion. What should she do? She could tell Rashid, face the consequences of her actions, and try to rebuild their shattered relationship. But could Rashid ever forgive her for this? Could she live with the shame of tearing their marriage apart? Or she could leave. She could run away with Omar, start fresh somewhere new, with the man who had stolen her heart. But would that be any better? Could she live with the weight of leaving behind everything, her home, her family, her community, and starting over with a man who had been her brother-in-law? She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to make the right choice. Every decision seemed like a betrayal. Every road led to more pain. The doorbell rang, and Layla froze. She wiped her eyes, quickly trying to compose herself. Was it Rashid? Was it Omar? Or was it someone else? Whoever it was, she knew that the time for secrets was running out. She had to make a choice, and soon. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Layla took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She had made her decision. Now, she just had to face the consequences. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed the discovery of Layla's pregnancy felt like an eternity. The weight of the secret pressed on her chest, suffocating her. Each moment, each breath, felt heavy with the unspoken words she could not bring herself to say. She spent hours pacing the house, the walls closing in around her as she tried to find a way out, but there was no escape. The truth would come out soon, whether she was ready or not. And when it did, everything she had known, everything she had loved, would be destroyed. Rashid's schedule remained the same. Long hours at work, late nights spent in front of a computer screen. Layla barely saw him anymore, except for brief moments in the morning before he left, and again at night when he returned, exhausted and distant. There was no connection. There was no intimacy. They were two strangers cohabiting the same space, living parallel lives but never truly engaging. The guilt was eating her alive, but there was no way to tell him. There was no way to undo the damage that had already been done. She had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, and the thought of facing him with the truth was unbearable. She couldn't imagine the look in his eyes, the heartbreak and betrayal that would surely flood his face when he realized what she had done. Every time she thought about confessing, the thought of Omar crept into her mind. His presence had changed everything. He had become her anchor, her confidant, the one person who truly understood her. But now, he was also the reason she was in this mess. He had been the one to fill the void left by Rashid, the one to make her feel seen and wanted again. But with the baby growing inside her, the situation was more complicated than ever. Omar had been insistent that they needed to make a choice. That they couldn't keep living in the shadows, pretending like nothing had changed. His texts had become more frequent, more desperate. "We can't keep pretending. We need to figure this out, Layla. I need to know where we stand." Each time she received one of his messages, her stomach twisted. She wanted to reply, to tell him that she was just as confused as he was, but the truth was that she had no idea what she wanted anymore. She was trapped between the two men she loved, caught in a web of guilt, shame, and fear. And the longer she waited, the harder it became to make a decision. One evening, as Layla sat in the living room staring at the blank TV screen, the weight of her thoughts finally reached a breaking point. She couldn't put it off any longer. She had to face the truth. The question that had been haunting her for weeks, "What do I do now?" had no easy answer. She couldn't keep running from it. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Omar. "We need to talk. I can't keep doing this. Please, let's figure this out. What are we going to do?" The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding him, and she certainly couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong. But telling Rashid? That was the one thing she couldn't bear. She couldn't bring herself to destroy everything she had built with him. But could she really walk away from Omar? Could she live with the weight of the lie she was carrying, knowing that she was keeping a child from Rashid, the man who deserved to know the truth? As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard the sound of the door opening. Rashid had returned home earlier than usual. Layla's heart raced. She hadn't expected him home this soon, and she was unprepared to face him. The tension in the room was palpable. She could feel the weight of her secret hanging in the air between them, and it seemed as though the very walls of the house were closing in. "Layla?" Rashid's voice broke through the silence, tentative, uncertain. She turned toward him, and their eyes met. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. She could see the exhaustion on his face, the weariness of a man who had been carrying the burden of his own life, but there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen in a long time, a flicker of concern. "How are you?" he asked, his voice soft. "You've been so distant lately. Is everything okay?" Layla's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to confess, to end the secrecy, but the words wouldn't come. She could barely breathe, let alone speak. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. "Just tired." Rashid nodded, though the look in his eyes told her that he wasn't convinced. He sat down next to her on the couch, the space between them feeling unnaturally large. They both sat in silence for a long time, the weight of unspoken words pressing heavily on both of them. Finally, Rashid spoke again. "You know you can talk to me, right? If something's wrong, if you're upset. I'm here for you, Layla." His words should have been comforting, but they only made the pain in her chest grow. She was so close to the edge, so close to confessing everything, but the fear of what it would do to him, to their family, held her back. How could she break his heart? How could she betray him in this way? Before she could speak, her phone buzzed again. It was another message from Omar, this time more urgent. "Please, Layla. I need you. We need to talk. This can't go on any longer." Layla felt a wave of panic rise within her. She looked at Rashid, then at the phone, and for a moment, the world seemed to spin. There was no easy way out of this. No simple solution. "Layla?" Rashid's voice broke through her thoughts. "What's going on? Who's that?" Layla's heart pounded in her chest. She had two choices in front of her, two paths, both leading to destruction. She could tell Rashid the truth, but that would tear their world apart. Or she could walk away from him, from everything they had, and choose to be with Omar, knowing full well that she would carry the guilt of her betrayal with her for the rest of her life. I need to go, she said, standing up abruptly. I'll be right back. Without waiting for a response, Layla hurried to the front door, the weight of her decision crushing her with every step. As she opened the door, she knew that her life would never be the same again. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. The night air outside was thick with the heavy scent of rain, but Layla felt none of it. She stood by the door, her hands trembling as she closed it behind her with a soft click, leaving Rashid inside, clueless, trusting, unaware. Her heart hammered in her chest, as though it, too, was trying to escape. The weight of her decision bore down on her as she made her way through the dark streets of Oakridge. There was no turning back now. Layla had made a choice. It wasn't the right choice. It wasn't the easy choice. But in that moment, with her heart racing and her mind clouded by the storm of guilt and confusion, it had seemed the only one she could make. She had to go to Omar. He was the only one who understood her now. Omar had seen the parts of her no one else had. He had listened when no one else would, given her the attention she had so desperately needed. Their connection had started innocently enough, but it had grown into something dangerous, something impossible to ignore. Omar was no longer just a distraction or a brother-in-law, he had become a reflection of the parts of her that had long been buried. Her fingers gripped her phone, the screen glowing with his name. She had read his messages over and over again, each one urging her to make a choice, to decide their future. And now, the time had come to face that choice. She dialed his number, the phone ringing in her ear. Each ring felt like an eternity. She didn't know what she was going to say when he picked up. There were no more lies she could tell, no more excuses. There was only the truth, and the ugly consequences that would come with it. When Omar finally answered, his voice was calm, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "Layla," he said, his voice steady. "Are you okay?" "I'm coming over," she whispered, her words barely audible. I can't do this anymore." "Layla, wait." "What's?" But she hung up before he could finish. The silence that followed was deafening, but she couldn't bring herself to listen to his concerns, to the questions that would only make her decision harder. She knew what had to be done, and the time for hesitation was long past. She needed Omar. She needed him to hold her, to make sense of the mess her life had become. When she arrived at his apartment, the door was already open, waiting for her. She stepped inside, her breath shallow, and found him standing by the window, staring out into the night. The dim light from the street lamps cast shadows across his face, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were drawn tight with worry. He had been waiting for her. "Omar," she said, her voice fragile, her heart breaking at the sight of him. She couldn't hold back the tears anymore. I made a choice." He turned to face her, his eyes searching her face, his expression torn between hope and uncertainty. He opened his arms to her, and without thinking, she rushed into them, burying her face in his chest. The warmth of his embrace felt like a lifeline, but it also felt like the last step toward the abyss. This was it. She was about to burn everything she had, her marriage, her family, and the trust she had worked so hard to build. "I can't stay with him anymore," she whispered into his shirt, her tears soaking through the fabric. "I can't live this lie, Omar. I love you. I've always loved you." Omar's hands tightened around her, pulling her closer, his voice soft but filled with urgency. "Layla, are you sure about this? What about Rashid? What about everything you've built with him?" Layla pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes red from crying, her face pale with exhaustion. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. But I can't keep pretending. I can't keep living this lie." The words hung between them like a verdict. A choice had been made. A fateful, irreversible decision. Omar kissed her forehead gently, his hands still cradling her face. He pulled away slowly, as if afraid that the moment they shared would shatter the fragile illusion of safety they had built around themselves. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice hoarse. "We'll figure it out together." For a brief moment, Layla allowed herself to believe it. That everything could somehow be fixed. That she could walk away from Rashid, from the life she had known, and start anew with Omar. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. There was no clean break, no easy path forward. There would be consequences, both for her and for those around her. As the night wore on, Layla found herself lost in the warmth of Omar's arms, feeling a sense of comfort she hadn't known in years. It felt like freedom, a freedom from the suffocating constraints of her marriage, a freedom from the expectations placed on her as a wife and a daughter. In Omar's arms, she felt alive again. But with that feeling came a sharp sting of guilt. Rashid was still in her life, still in their home, still unaware of the betrayal that had taken root between his wife and his brother. The next morning, Layla woke to find Omar still sleeping beside her. She didn't know how to feel. Part of her was relieved that she had made her decision. Another part of her felt hollow, like a part of her soul had been ripped out. She had lost everything, her marriage, her family's trust, her sense of identity. But at least she had Omar. At least she had someone who loved her. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer it. But when she saw the caller ID, her heart dropped. It was Rashid. She hesitated. What would she say to him? How could she explain everything? There was no easy way out. There was no way to make this right. The lies, the deception, the pain, they were all too much to bear. But this was her reality now. And no matter how hard she tried to avoid it, the consequences were inevitable. With a trembling hand, Layla answered the phone. "Layla?" Rashid's voice crackled through the line, tired but full of concern. "Where are you? I've been trying to reach you." She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. The words that came next would change everything. "I'm not coming home," she said, her voice breaking as she spoke. I can't do this anymore." The silence that followed felt suffocating, the weight of her decision pressing down on her with the force of 1,000 regrets. Rashid's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Layla, please. Don't do this." But it was too late. The damage had been done. The truth had already shattered everything she had ever known. And there was no turning back now. The days that followed Layla's decision were a blur. What had seemed like a choice, a path she believed would set her free, quickly unraveled into something far darker, far more complicated than she could have imagined. She had made her decision to leave Rashid and build a life with Omar, but the consequences of her actions began to take a heavy toll. Rashid had been left in the wake of her departure, struggling to understand the woman he had loved, the woman who had once promised to stand by his side through everything. Layla knew that his confusion, his hurt, would be deep. She had always been his anchor, his constant in a life that often felt chaotic. And now, without her, everything was falling apart. Her phone buzzed constantly in the days after she left, but Layla couldn't bring herself to answer Rashid's calls. She couldn't listen to his voice crack with emotion, couldn't bear the idea of hearing the pain in his words. She had already destroyed him. What more could she say? Omar was there, as he always had been. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of their secret began to push against them. Layla had thought that being with Omar would bring her peace, that his love would be the balm she so desperately needed to heal her wounds. But it didn't feel like that anymore. His love, though passionate and intense, had become a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Their relationship, once electric and filled with promise, now felt like a fragile, precarious thing. Layla couldn't help but feel the shadow of guilt lurking in every moment they shared. The baby growing inside her, a child she could never share with Rashid, felt like an unspoken reminder of everything that had gone wrong. She couldn't escape the truth of what she had done. She couldn't escape the weight of the choices she had made. One evening, as she and Omar sat on the couch, the air between them thick with tension, Layla felt the truth settle on her like a heavy stone. This wasn't freedom. This wasn't the life she had imagined. She had left behind her marriage, her family, her faith, and in exchange, she had gained only uncertainty and regret. Omar had tried to assure her, tried to convince her that everything would be okay, that they would figure it out together. But Layla knew better. She had destroyed the life she once had, and now, there was no turning back. The walls she had built around herself, the walls she had built around her family, were crumbling. Rashid would never forgive her. Her community would never accept her. And the love she thought she had found with Omar was beginning to feel like another cage, another mistake in a long line of choices that had led her here. It was on one of those long, sleepless nights that Layla made another decision. She had to face Rashid. She had to confront the consequences of her betrayal. But she knew, deep down, that it would never be the same again. She couldn't undo the hurt she had caused, couldn't take back the lies she had told. But she had to try. She called him. "Rashid," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you." The line was silent for a moment before he spoke, his voice hoarse, filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Layla? Where are you? What's happening? I've been trying to reach you. I've been looking for you." "I know," she said, her heart breaking with each word. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I should have never lied." There was a long pause. Layla could hear Rashid's breath on the other end of the line, a soft, painful sound. She knew that this was the moment, when the truth would finally come out. She knew that it would shatter him, but it was the only thing she could do. "I'm here with Omar," she continued, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant, Rashid. But the baby isn't yours. I've been with Omar. I've betrayed you." The silence was deafening. Layla could hear the crack in Rashid's voice when he spoke again. "Why, Layla? Why did you do this? We were happy. I loved you. I trusted you." "I'm so sorry," Layla whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted to destroy everything we had. But I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep living a lie." Rashid didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his words were cold, distant. "I don't know who you are anymore, Layla. I don't know how I can ever forgive you for this." With that, the call ended. Layla sat there, staring at her phone, the words, "I don't know who you are anymore," echoing in her mind. She had lost him. She had lost everything. Rashid, her family, her community, all of it was gone, destroyed by her own hands. And for what? For a fleeting moment of passion, for the desire to feel seen, to feel loved again. She had sacrificed everything for something that had never been hers to begin with. As the days passed, Layla found herself drifting further from the life she once knew. Her relationship with Omar grew more strained as they both struggled to cope with the fallout of their actions. The guilt weighed heavily on both of them. They had what they wanted, but at what cost? Omar had become a shadow of the man she had once admired. Their love had grown toxic, consumed by the lies and betrayal that lay at its core. Layla's once vibrant world had turned gray, filled with the ashes of her decisions. She had burned every bridge, lost every connection, and now, there was nothing left but the consequences of her choices. She thought she could escape her past, but now, she realized, the past had followed her. It would haunt her forever. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror one last time, Layla understood the truth. The price of deception was higher than she could have ever imagined. The lies, the guilt, the heartache, nothing could undo the damage she had done. And now, she had to live with it. Her life was a wreck, and there was no way to rebuild it. All she could do now was face the consequences and wonder how she had gone so far off course. What do you think of Layla's story? Do you think she made the right choice? Could she have handled the situation differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories. We'd love to hear from you.